Isabel's hands hovered over the piano keys, her breath shallow as the room watched in tense silence. The restaurant's golden lights sparkled off the polished grand piano, framing her as if she were on stage. Leonard's smirk cut through the quiet, his mocking laughter lingering in her mind. The dining room of La Fontaine had never been so still. The clink of silverware and soft murmurs that usually filled the air had disappeared, replaced by a collective anticipation. Isabelle closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the weight of their stares. Her heart raced. She felt the judgment from Leonard's entourage, the wealthy diners who had paused mid-conversation to see if she could deliver. This wasn't a performance she'd prepared for. It was a challenge, a trap set to humiliate her. "Go ahead," Leonard's voice drawled from his table, louder than necessary. "Show us your hidden talent." Isabel's jaw tightened, her mind echoing her mother's voice from years ago. "Never let anyone make you feel small." Taking a shaky breath, she pressed the first note, the sound soft but deliberate. The melody began, trembling but growing stronger, as the tension in the room reached its peak. Isabel's life hadn't always been about balancing trays and navigating crowded restaurant floors. She grew up in a small town in South Carolina, where dreams often felt like a luxury. Her mother, a single parent working as a nurse, poured her heart into providing for Isabel and her two siblings. Money was scarce, but the house always felt full of love and resilience. Music entered Isabel's life almost by accident. A kind neighbor gifted their family an old piano. Its keys chipped and its sound slightly out of tune. It sat in the corner of their modest living room, unnoticed at first. But for Isabelle, it became a world of possibilities. She started by mimicking songs she heard on the radio. What began as simple tunes soon evolved into complex melodies as Isabelle taught herself classical pieces from secondhand music books. That piano became her escape. While other kids ran outside to play, Isabelle would sit at the piano for hours, her fingers exploring its keys. Music became her language, a way to express emotions she couldn't put into words. The neighbors began to notice her talent, and soon she was playing at church services, school events, and local community gatherings. People in her small town admired her gift, and Isabelle dreamed of bigger stages. She imagined herself performing in grand concert halls, her music touching hearts far beyond her hometown. But reality wasn't kind. Scholarships she applied for didn't come through, and financial pressures at home demanded her attention. By the time she turned 18, her path seemed less like a dream and more like a series of compromises. Isabelle took on jobs to help her family, shelving her ambitions for the moment. Still, music remained a part of her. The melodies she'd once played stayed in her mind, like a promise she hadn't yet fulfilled. A few years later, she moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, hoping for a fresh start. The city brought new opportunities, but also new challenges. La Fontaine wasn't just a job for Isabelle, it was a lifeline. The upscale restaurant provided her with steady pay and a stable routine. But what truly drew her to it was the grand piano in the corner of the dining room. Even though she rarely had the chance to play, its presence reminded her that her dream hadn't completely faded. Her colleagues occasionally heard her during quiet moments, when she'd steal away to the piano after hours. They would applaud her talent, but to the restaurant's patrons, she was just another waitress. To most, Isabelle blended into the background, a small part of the restaurant's refined ambiance. Still, Isabelle's connection to music never wavered. Even while balancing trays and managing demanding customers, she found herself humming the tunes she used to play. Each time she glanced at the piano, she felt a mix of hope and sadness. It was a symbol of what she'd left behind and what she still longed to reclaim. But on this particular night, something would change. What began as an ordinary evening would test Isabelle in ways she couldn't imagine. Leonard Grayson's entrance would not only disrupt the restaurant's atmosphere, but force Isabelle to confront her fears and rediscover her strength. The evening at La Fontaine was settling into its usual rhythm when the door swung open and Leonard Grayson entered. His arrival wasn't subtle. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he strode in with a confidence that turned heads. Leonard had a way of making every room feel like his stage. His entourage followed closely, mimicking his swagger. Leonard was a well-known entrepreneur, his name synonymous with wealth and arrogance. Stories of his sharp tongue and condescending humor often preceded him, and tonight was no different. Isabelle noticed him instantly but kept her head down. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but Leonard was in a league of his own. As Leonard scanned the room, his gaze landed on Isabelle. For a moment he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, then curling into a smirk. Isabelle felt his stare but refused to acknowledge it, focusing on clearing plates from a nearby table. To her, he was just another demanding guest. But to Leonard, Isabelle had already become the center of his attention. He took his seat at a table near the piano, gesturing for his companions to join him. The restaurant staff exchanged wary glances, knowing Leonard's reputation. His booming voice soon filled the space, recounting tales of his success and making jokes at the expense of others. His entourage laughed dutifully, but the other diners seemed less amused. Isabelle approached Leonard's table, her movements careful and practiced. "Good evening. May I take your order?" she asked politely, avoiding his gaze. Leonard leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Isabelle," he said, glancing at her name tag. "That's a strong name. You seem like someone with hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she responded with a simple nod. "What would you like to order?" she repeated, trying to keep the interaction brief. Leonard grinned, his voice dripping with amusement. "We'll start with your best bottle of wine. Impress me." Isabelle turned to place the order, ignoring the quiet laughter at the table. As she walked away, she could feel his gaze following her, as though he was already planning his next move. For Leonard, the evening wasn't just about dining, it was about entertainment. And tonight, he had decided Isabelle would provide it. As Leonard settled into his seat, his voice began to dominate the room. He recounted stories of his business triumphs, peppered with sharp comments about people who, in his words, lacked ambition. His entourage chuckled at every line, their laughter echoing louder than the soft jazz playing in the background. Other diners exchanged uneasy glances, their once peaceful evening disrupted. Isabelle stayed busy, moving between tables with practiced efficiency. She avoided Leonard's gaze, focusing on her tasks, but the tension was impossible to ignore. When she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard leaned forward, his smirk widening. "So, Isabelle," he said, his tone louder than necessary, "what do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely someone like you has dreams." Isabelle hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I play piano sometimes," she said softly, hoping to keep the moment brief. Leonard's eyes lit up with amusement, and his smile curled into something sharper. "A pianist?" he said, his voice carrying across the room. "How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance? There's a piano right there." The words hung in the air, and Isabelle froze. "Oh, I couldn't," she replied quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard wasn't letting it go. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming. "Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience. Show us what you've got." The restaurant went quiet, the hum of conversation fading as every eye turned to Isabelle. Her chest tightened and her hands clenched the tray she was holding. She glanced at her colleagues, hoping for support, but they seemed just as stunned as she was. "I really shouldn't," Isabelle said again, her voice quieter now. But Leonard leaned back in his chair, his smirk turning smug. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words hit harder than she expected. Isabelle wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the way Leonard dismissed her, as though she was nothing more than a joke, cut deep. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a memory she couldn't shake. "Never let anyone make you feel small. You're bigger than they'll ever know." She looked at Leonard, then at the piano. His challenge was a trap, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to reclaim the part of herself she'd kept hidden for so long. "Fine," Isabelle said, her voice low but steady. "I'll play." The room buzzed with anticipation as she set the tray down and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, but her resolve didn't falter. Leonard leaned back in his chair, smug satisfaction written all over his face. The grand piano gleamed under the restaurant's soft lighting, waiting for her. As Isabelle sat down, her hands hovered over the keys. The room held its breath, waiting to see if she would rise to the challenge or crumble under its weight. The restaurant was eerily silent as Isabelle sat before the grand piano. Her fingers hovered over the polished keys, trembling slightly. She could feel every gaze in the room fixed on her, some curious, others judgmental. Leonard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk etched deeply into his face. His confidence was palpable, as though he'd already won whatever game he thought he was playing. Isabelle closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. Her mother's words echoed in her mind again. Never let anyone make you feel small. She wasn't here to entertain Leonard or his entourage. She was here for herself, to prove that she was more than the uniform she wore, or the assumptions people made about her. Her fingers pressed the first key. The note was soft, tentative, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats and someone let out a faint cough. Ignoring the distractions, Isabelle let her hands move, allowing muscle memory to guide her. The melody began to flow, each note blending into the next, hesitant at first but gaining strength with every passing second. As the music swelled, Isabelle lost herself in the melody. She played a soulful rendition of a classical piece she had known for years, one that spoke to her heart. The notes carried a story, her story. They spoke of late nights spent practicing, her mother's sacrifices, and the countless dreams she had quietly held on to. The room began to shift. The initial skepticism in the air faded, replaced by something heavier and more respectful. The diners, who moments earlier had been spectators to Leonard's taunting, now watched with awe. Conversations had ceased, and even Leonard's entourage sat quietly, their smug grins replaced by faint expressions of discomfort. Leonard himself was silent, his smirk faltering as he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand what he was hearing. This wasn't just music, it was defiance, strength, and emotion in its purest form. Isabelle's hands glided across the keys with increasing confidence, her fear melting away. For the first time in years, she felt free. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a dreamer stuck in limbo. She was an artist, and this moment belonged to her. The crescendo built, the melody soaring to its peak before softly winding back down. Isabelle's hands lingered on the final note, letting the sound fade into silence. The room was utterly still, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. She sat there for a moment, her heart racing, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the restaurant erupted into applause. Some diners stood clapping loudly, their expressions filled with admiration. Isabelle's colleagues joined in, their faces lit with pride. Leonard remained seated, his smirk completely gone. His once overconfident demeanor had been replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Isabelle didn't need to look at him to know that the power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. Isabelle let her hands rest on the keys for a moment, taking in the silence that surrounded her. The room held its breath, the tension thick as everyone waited to see what she would do next. She closed her eyes briefly, shutting out the room and centering herself. This wasn't about Leonard anymore. This was her chance to reclaim what she thought she had lost: her voice, her passion, her dream. The first note came softly, a delicate whisper that seemed to hang in the air. She played cautiously at first, her hands finding the familiar rhythm of a piece she had known by heart for years. The music began to take shape, each note weaving into the next, growing stronger and more confident. It was a soulful rendition of Clair de Lune, a piece that had always resonated with her. Isabelle's fingers moved with precision, yet there was something raw in the way she played. It wasn't just a performance, it was a story, her story. Each chord spoke of the nights she had spent at her mother's old piano, the sacrifices they had made, and the dreams she had tucked away but never abandoned. The room remained silent, captivated by the transformation unfolding before them. The soft hum of conversation and clinking of silverware had ceased entirely. Even Leonard's entourage, who had been chuckling moments earlier, now sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. The diners, who had been indifferent, now leaned forward, their faces reflecting awe and admiration. As Isabelle's confidence grew, so did the intensity of the music. The melody swelled, filling the room with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Her fingers danced across the keys, each movement precise and deliberate, yet filled with emotion. The notes carried her heartache, her resilience, and her unyielding determination. Leonard, who had leaned back smugly in his chair when she started, was now sitting upright. His smirk had faded, replaced by an expression that bordered on disbelief. He watched intently, his usual confidence shaken. He had intended to humiliate her, but instead, he found himself humbled. The crescendo built, the music reaching its peak with an intensity that seemed to reverberate through the room. Isabel's body moved with the rhythm, her entire being poured into the performance. The piano seemed to sing, its notes ringing out like a declaration of strength and defiance. And then, slowly, the melody began to wind down. The notes softened, their power giving way to a gentle conclusion. Isabel's fingers lingered on the final chord, letting it resonate until the sound faded into silence. She sat still, her hands resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling with each breath. For a moment, the room remained silent, as though the audience was too stunned to react. Then, as if breaking free from a spell, the applause began. It started softly but quickly grew, filling the room with a thunderous roar. Diners clapped enthusiastically, some standing in their seats. Isabel's colleagues, who had watched nervously from the sidelines, now cheered with pride. Their smiles were wide, their admiration evident. Even the kitchen staff peeked out from behind the swinging doors, drawn by the commotion. Leonard's entourage exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now a distant memory. They clapped hesitantly, clearly unsure of how to react. And Leonard himself? He remained seated, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. His expression was unreadable, his usual bravado replaced by something far more subdued. Isabelle finally looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room. The diners' faces reflected admiration, respect, and even awe. She met Leonard's eyes briefly, but there was no need for words. Her performance had spoken louder than any rebuttal ever could. The room began to settle as the applause faded. Isabelle stood slowly, her knees trembling but her back straight. She gave a small, polite nod to the audience, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had reclaimed a part of herself that she thought was lost. The weight of the moment hung in the air as she walked back to her station. She passed Leonard's table without stopping, his slow clap still echoing faintly behind her. For the first time, she felt a lightness in her step, a newfound confidence blooming within her. The applause echoed throughout the room, thunderous and unrelenting. Diners clapped with enthusiasm, some rising to their feet in admiration. Isabelle stood at the piano, frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the response. She hadn't expected this. The genuine respect, the warmth radiating from strangers who had been indifferent just moments ago. Her colleagues beamed at her from across the room, their pride evident in their expressions. A few gave her small nods of encouragement, their quiet way of showing support. Even the restaurant's stern maître d', known for his strict demeanor, allowed a rare smile to cross his face. Isabelle finally stood, her knees still trembling, but her back straight. She gave a polite nod to the diners who clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint, humble smile. It wasn't triumph she felt, but relief, a quiet sense of fulfillment that she hadn't let fear silence her. Leonard remained seated, his slow clap cutting through the cheers. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Isabelle couldn't quite read. He seemed caught between admiration and discomfort, his usual confidence shaken. For the first time that evening, he looked less like the arrogant millionaire and more like a man unsure of himself. "Well," Leonard said, his voice louder than necessary as the applause began to fade, "that was unexpected." He chuckled, but the sound lacked its usual bravado. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places?" The comment landed awkwardly, a faint ripple of discomfort passing through his table. His entourage exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Leonard's attempt to regain control of the moment fell flat. Isabelle tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant as an olive branch, but they felt hollow, weighed down by his inability to fully own his misstep. Still, she wasn't about to let him pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose. "Thank you," Isabelle said simply, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. It was a measured response, one that left no room for further patronizing remarks. Leonard cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward a waiter for another drink, an obvious attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he said, almost begrudgingly. Isabelle nodded once. "Everyone has a gift," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The subtle sting of her words rippled through the air, leaving Leonard silent. The diners who had been watching the exchange closely seemed to exhale collectively. The atmosphere shifted again, this time filled with quiet respect for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. As the night continued, Isabelle returned to her station, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was herself, an artist who had reclaimed her voice. The night at La Fontaine carried on, but everything felt different now. Isabelle moved through the dining room with a newfound purpose. Each step she took felt lighter, her confidence radiating in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She was still a waitress, refilling glasses and clearing plates, but the way people looked at her had changed. Several diners stopped her as she passed their tables. "You were incredible," an older woman said softly, her hand gently touching Isabelle's arm. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." Another man chimed in. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Isabelle smiled humbly, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments, they were validations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of. She thanked each person sincerely, their words lingering in her mind like melodies she didn't want to forget. Even her colleagues treated her differently. A quiet nod from the bartender, a subtle thumbs up from the busboy, and a whispered, "You nailed it," from a fellow server all reinforced the sense of accomplishment she felt. The staff, who had always admired her talent in passing, now seemed genuinely proud to work alongside her. Meanwhile, Leonard's table was subdued. His entourage, once loud and confident, now avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. Their conversation had dwindled to murmurs, their bravado replaced by awkward silence. Leonard himself sat stiffly, swirling his drink in his hand. The man who had walked in commanding attention now seemed smaller, his usual dominance overshadowed by the night's events. As Isabelle approached Leonard's table to deliver the check, he looked up at her, his expression teetering between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said curtly, sliding his credit card across the table. "No need to rub it in." Isabelle paused, meeting his gaze directly. Her voice was calm but firm as she replied, "It was never about proving anything to you. I just wanted to play." Leonard opened his mouth as if to respond, but quickly closed it again. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what to say. He fidgeted with his glass, his usual air of dominance completely stripped away. One of Leonard's companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, broke the silence. "You were amazing," he said sincerely, his voice cutting through the awkward tension. "Truly." The unexpected kindness caught Isabelle off guard, but she smiled in return. "Thank you," she said simply before turning to walk away. The tips from that night were unusually generous. By the end of her shift, Isabelle realized she had earned enough to cover her rent and still have some left over, enough to finally take the piano lessons she had been postponing. As she locked up the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp night air, Isabelle felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The events of the evening had been unexpected, but they had reminded her of something she had almost forgotten: her worth. Walking home, she thought not of Leonard or his entourage, but of her future. For the first time, her dreams felt within reach. She was more than a waitress, more than a struggling artist. She was someone with a voice, someone with something to offer the world. When she arrived at her small apartment, she sat at her old upright piano. The keys were worn, and the sound wasn't as rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine. But it didn't matter. Isabelle placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The music came from her heart, just as it always had, and it reminded her that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. In the days that followed, word of Isabelle's performance spread quickly. Patrons who had witnessed her play shared the story with friends and family. Soon it became a topic of conversation among the city's restaurant-goers. "Did you hear about the waitress who stunned everyone at La Fontaine?" they'd ask, their voices filled with awe. The story reached farther than Isabelle could have imagined. One afternoon, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, her heart racing slightly. On the other end was a man who introduced himself as a music producer from Nashville. He had been dining at the restaurant that night and had been captivated by her performance. "I'm not offering fame or fortune," the producer said, his tone warm and genuine, "but I'd like to help you record a demo. You've got something special, and the world deserves to hear it." For a moment, Isabelle was speechless. This wasn't the break she had dreamed of as a teenager, but it was an opportunity, a door she hadn't expected to open. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'd love that." The call left her feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the demo or what it could lead to. It was about the reminder that her dreams weren't as far away as she'd once thought. As Isabelle sat at her piano that evening, her fingers gliding over the familiar keys, she reflected on how much had changed. The grand piano at La Fontaine had given her a moment to shine, but it was her resilience and authenticity that had truly carried her forward. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliation turned triumph. It had been a test of her strength, a chance to rediscover her voice and remind herself of her worth. Leonard, with all his wealth and bravado, had tried to make her feel small, but he hadn't succeeded. The world is full of Leonard Graysons, Isabelle thought, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power doesn't come from putting others down. It comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passion speak for itself. That night, as she played softly in her apartment, Isabelle smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your first step forward now